Tonight we journey back to a time when survival on the American frontier meant learning to live beneath the very ground you hope to farm. This is the story of how pioneers built underground shelters to survive brutal winters, transforming hills and prairies into homes that would shield them from nature's most merciless assaults. Before we begin, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I hope you're somewhere warm and comfortable, perhaps wrapped in blankets, safe from whatever weather stirs outside your window. Hold that comfort close as we travel back to a time when warmth meant everything, when the difference between a well-built shelter and a poorly constructed one could mean the difference between waking to spring's first thaw or never waking at all. The land stretched endlessly before them, rolling grasslands that moved like ocean waves under prairie winds. For the settlers who came west in the mid-1800s, answering the call of cheap land and new opportunities, the Great Plains presented a paradox. Here was soil so rich it could grow crops beyond imagination, land so abundant the government was practically giving it away under the Homestead Act of 1862. Yet this same land offered almost nothing with which to build shelter. No forests stretched across these grasslands. No stone outcroppings provided ready materials for construction. Just grass, endless grass, and the soil beneath it. The pioneers who came to Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, and the broader Great Plains region found themselves facing an immediate crisis. They needed shelter, and they needed it quickly. Winter on the plains was not something to face unprepared. The same openness that made the land so appealing for agriculture made it murderously exposed to weather systems that swept down from Canada with nothing to slow their advance. Temperatures could plummet 40 degrees in a matter of hours. Blizzards could rage for days, creating whiteout conditions where a person could become lost between house and barn, freezing to death mere yards from safety. These settlers, many of them immigrants from Europe or migrants from the eastern United States, had to abandon everything they knew about home construction. The log cabins of their previous experience required trees. The stone houses of European tradition required quarries. The frame houses they'd known needed lumber, which had to be transported across vast distances at costs most homesteading families simply couldn't afford. Even when lumber could be obtained, the treeless plains offered no windbreaks, and frame houses stood exposed to winds that could tear shingles from roofs and drive cold through every crack and seam. The solution lay quite literally beneath their feet. The very soil that would nourish their crops could also shelter their families. The thick prairie sod, bound together by the roots of grasses that had grown undisturbed for millennia, could be cut into blocks as solid as any brick. The hills and ravines that marked the landscape could be excavated to create spaces protected by the earth itself. And so the dugout and the sod house became the pioneers' answer to the challenge of shelter on a treeless plain. This wasn't new technology. Humans had been building earth shelters for thousands of years, from the ancient pit houses of prehistoric peoples to the Yaodong caves still inhabited in China. The Icelanders had perfected turf houses centuries before. Native American tribes had built earth lodges long before European contact. But for the American pioneers, many of them arriving from comfortable eastern cities or European villages where shelter was taken for granted, the idea of living underground represented both a practical necessity and a profound psychological adjustment. The story of these underground shelters is the story of adaptation, of people learning to work with rather than against their environment, It's the story of families who dug into hillsides with nothing more than shovels and determination, who cut prairie sod into building blocks weighing 50 pounds each, who roofed their homes with layers of grass and dirt that would grow new grass come spring. It's the story of women who kept house in spaces carved from the earth, hanging curtains over dirt walls and sweeping earthen floors. It's the story of children who grew up in homes where snakes occasionally dropped from ceilings and mice burrowed through walls, yet who remembered these places with fondness because they meant safety, warmth, and family. The dugout and sod house represent one of the most ingenious solutions to environmental challenge in American history. These structures kept families warm when temperatures outside dropped to 40 below zero. They stayed cool when summer heat climbed above 100 degrees. They stood firm when tornadoes that would have demolished frame houses roared across the prairie. They could be built for almost no money, using materials available on site, with tools as simple as a spade and a plough. Yet they also represented hardship. Living underground meant darkness, even at midday. It meant sharing your home with every creature that burrowed through soil. It meant walls that dripped for days after every rain, ceilings that shed dirt into food and bedding, floors that turned to mud when water seeped in. It meant a social stigma, the feeling that you lived like an animal in a burrow rather than a human in a proper house. The pressure to move up and out, to graduate from dugout to frame house, was intense, even when the dugout provided more practical comfort. As we explore the world of pioneer underground shelters, we'll examine every aspect of these remarkable structures. We'll learn how settlers chose their sites, weighing factors from drainage to sun exposure. We'll discover the techniques used to cut and lay sod bricks, to excavate hillsides without causing collapse, to construct roofs that could bear the weight of earth and grass while shedding water. We'll step inside these homes and experience what daily life was like in a space where the walls were dirt and the ceiling was held up by cottonwood poles. We'll understand the seasonal rhythms of life in a dugout, the desperate struggle to stay warm during winter's worst, the equally challenging battle to keep cool in summer's heat. We'll meet the different cultural groups who brought their own variations to earth shelter construction, from Ukrainian Burdaise to French-Canadian Caveau. We'll learn about the dangers these shelters presented, from floods to cave-ins, and the tragedies that sometimes resulted. Most importantly, we'll come to appreciate the resourcefulness, determination, and sheer survival instinct of the people who lived in these shelters. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, people who discovered they could endure far more than they'd ever imagined possible. Their legacy lives on not just in the handful of preserved dugouts that still exist, but in the character of the communities they built and the lessons they passed down about adaptation, perseverance, and the ability to make a home anywhere. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare to journey back to a time when home meant a hole in the ground, when warmth meant earth walls holding back winter wind, when survival meant learning to live as part of the landscape rather than imposed upon it. This is the story of how American pioneers built underground shelters and survived brutal winters in homes made from the very soil they'd come west to farm. The Great Plains stretched across the heart of North America like a vast inland sea of grass, rolling in waves that reached from horizon to horizon. When the first European settlers pushed west past the forested regions of the Mississippi Valley, they encountered a landscape unlike anything they'd known. Here was land that defied every assumption they'd brought with them about what countryside should look like, about what resources would be available, about how humans ought to live. The absence of trees was the most shocking feature. Settlers from forested regions of the East, immigrants from the woodlands of Europe, all arrived expecting that building materials would be readily available as they'd always been. Instead, they found grass, endless grass, stretching as far as the eye could see, broken only by occasional cottonwood groves along creek beds and river valleys. The psychological impact of this treelessness cannot be overstated. Trees meant shelter, fuel, tools, comfort. Their absence meant vulnerability. The climate of the Great Plains compounded every challenge. This was a land of extremes, where summer temperatures could soar above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, where winter cold could plunge to 40 below. The weather could change with terrifying speed, a warm autumn afternoon transforming within hours into a blizzard that would rag for days. The wind was constant, relentless, a force that shaped every aspect of life on the plains. These prairie winds served as both blessing and curse. In summer they provided the only relief from oppressive heat, cooling sweat-soaked skin and making outdoor work bearable. But in winter they transformed cold into something deadly, driving temperatures down through the wind chill effect, finding every gap and crack in hastily built shelters, stealing heat and life with equal efficiency. A person caught outside in a prairie blizzard might freeze to death in minutes, the wind robbing their body of warmth faster than metabolism could replace it. The soil itself seemed to mock the settlers' needs. It was extraordinarily rich, the accumulated product of thousands of years of grass growth and decay, perfect for agriculture. Yet it was bound together by roots so thick and tough that breaking prairie sod for the first time required teams of oxen and specially designed ploughs with heavy iron blades. This same quality that made the soil difficult to farm made it ideal for building. The sod held together when cut, maintaining its shape and structure, creating natural bricks that required no additional binding. Water presented another challenge on the plains. Streams and rivers were few and far between, often seasonal, drying up in summer and freezing solid in winter. Wells had to be dug deep, sometimes more than 100 feet, requiring equipment and expertise that many homesteaders simply didn't possess. The absence of readily available water influenced every decision about where to settle, where to build, how to survive. The distances on the plains created a profound sense of isolation that affected mental health as much as physical well-being. Homesteads might be separated by miles of empty grassland. In winter, when travel became difficult or impossible, families could go months without seeing other human beings outside their immediate household. This isolation weighed heavily, particularly on women who'd come from communities where neighbours were close and social interaction was constant. The psychological toll of prairie isolation drove some to madness, a condition documented in medical records of the time as prairie fever. Into this challenging environment came people driven by desperation or dreams or both. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres of free land to anyone who would settle on it, improve it, and remain for 5 years, for landless peasants from Europe, for younger sons with no inheritance, for freedmen seeking a fresh start after the Civil War, for anyone willing to gamble hardship against opportunity. This promise was irresistible. They came in wagons loaded with tools and seed, household goods and hope. knowing almost nothing about the land they were coming to inhabit. The timing of arrival was crucial in ways newcomers rarely understood. Families who arrived in spring or early summer had months to establish themselves before winter. They could plant crops, build adequate shelter, accumulate fuel and supplies. Those who arrived in late summer or fall faced disaster. They might have time to throw up crude shelter, but not to prepare properly for winter. These late arrivals suffered most in the terrible winters that periodically swept the plains, winters like the legendary die-up of 1886 to 1887 that killed hundreds of thousands of cattle and left human casualties as well. The immediate question facing every new arrival was shelter. Where eastern settlers might have camped in wagons or tents while they built log cabins, plain settlers had no such luxury. Tents were worse than useless on the plains, offering no protection from wind and likely to be blown away entirely by the first major storm. Wagons provided cramped, uncomfortable shelter for short periods, but weren't viable for winter. Something more substantial was needed, and it was needed quickly. The solution was obvious once you adjusted your thinking. If you couldn't build up, build down. If you couldn't construct walls from wood or stone, cut them from the earth itself. The dugout represented the fastest path to adequate shelter. With nothing more than a shovel, a man could excavate a space in a hillside in a matter of days. With a bit of lumber for a door frame and roof supports, some brush and grass for roofing, he could create a space that would keep his family dry and relatively warm through their first winter. The dugout wasn't meant to be permanent. Almost everyone who built one intended it as temporary shelter, something to live in for a season or maybe a year, while they got crops planted and accumulated resources for a proper house. The reality often differed from intention. Many families lived in dugouts for years, discovering that the temporary shelter they'd thrown together actually worked remarkably well. The earth provided insulation that expensive lumber could never match. The sunken design protected against wind. The low profile meant tornadoes passed overhead without damage. Understanding why pioneers chose to build underground requires understanding not just the practical challenges they faced, but the broader context of westward expansion, agricultural development, and cultural adaptation. The settlement of the Great Plains represented one of the largest and fastest migrations in human history. Between the 1860s and the 1890s, hundreds of thousands of people moved onto land that had been home to nomadic Native American tribes for centuries. The speed of this settlement meant that knowledge and techniques couldn't develop gradually. Mistakes were made, often with fatal consequences, but survivors learned and adapted. The federal government encouraged this settlement through the Homestead Act and other land policies, but provided little practical support for the people it lured west. There were no housing programs, no infrastructure development, no safety nets for those who failed. Each family was essentially on its own, expected to survive through individual effort and resourcefulness. This self-reliance became part of the pioneer mythos celebrated in stories and songs, but it meant that hardship and death were common outcomes for those who lacked skills or experienced bad luck. The economic reality of homesteading also pushed families toward underground shelters. Most homesteaders arrived with limited capital. They needed to purchase seed, tools, and supplies for farming. They needed to keep enough money in reserve to sustain themselves until their first harvest, which might be a year or more away. Spending money on building materials for a house was often impossible. The dugout offered a way to obtain shelter without cash outlay. Everything needed could be found on site. Labor was free, provided by family members. The only cost was time and physical effort. This economic calculation was reinforced by uncertainty about whether the homestead would succeed. Plains farming was risky. Drought could destroy crops. Grasshopper plagues could strip fields bare in hours. Hailstorms could flatten wheat ready for harvest. Markets could collapse, leaving farmers with crops they couldn't sell at any price. Families who'd invested heavily in building a proper house might find themselves broke and unable to continue farming. Those who'd lived frugally in dugouts had resources to weather setbacks. The cultural backgrounds of the settlers also influenced their acceptance of underground shelter. Immigrants from Eastern Europe, particularly Ukrainians and Russians, brought traditions of earth-sheltered building. The burde of Ukrainian tradition was a semi-subterranean structure similar to the American dugout, serving as temporary shelter for families until they could build more permanent homes. Mennonites from Russia, Norwegians and Swedes all had cultural memories of turf houses and earth shelters. For these groups, living underground was less strange, more acceptable than it was for British or American-born settlers who had no such traditions. The climate itself made underground construction not just practical, but superior in many ways to above-ground alternatives. The Earth maintains a relatively constant temperature below a certain depth, typically around 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit in the plains region. This meant that a properly constructed dugout would stay cool in summer, when surface temperatures soared above 100 degrees, and would stay relatively warm in winter, when outside temperatures dropped below zero. The insulating value of Earth exceeded anything pioneers could afford to build with conventional materials. This thermal performance became obvious through experience. Families who'd built frame houses often found themselves freezing in winter, despite keeping fires burning constantly, burning through fuel supplies at unsustainable rates. Meanwhile, neighbours in dugouts stayed comfortable with far less fuel. Summer was even more dramatic. Frame houses became ovens in plains heat, uninhabitable during midday hours, while dugouts remained cool enough for comfort. Many families who'd moved from dugouts to frame houses found themselves returning to the dugout for sleeping quarters in summer. The protective value of underground shelter against storms also became clear over time. Plains tornadoes were unlike the storms pioneers had experienced in other regions. These were massive, violent events that could destroy anything above ground. Frame houses were simply obliterated, scattered across miles of prairie. Even well-built structures stood little chance. But dugouts and sod houses, low to the ground or actually in it, were generally untouched. The wind passed over them. Families who huddled in dugouts during tornado outbreaks walked out after the storm to find their neighbours' homes destroyed, while their own remained intact. This protective aspect extended to other weather threats. Prairie fires, driven by wind, could sweep across grasslands at terrifying speed, consuming everything in their path. Frame houses burned, their occupants sometimes trapped inside. Sod houses and dugouts wouldn't burn. The earth itself was fireproof. Lightning strikes which could destroy wooden structures had little effect on earth-sheltered buildings. The psychological comfort this provided should not be underestimated. Knowing your home couldn't burn, couldn't be blown away, couldn't be destroyed by hail or lightning, created a sense of security that above-ground structures couldn't match. the gradual acceptance of underground shelter by the pioneer community represented a profound shift in cultural attitudes about what constituted a proper home. Initially, living underground carried significant stigma. It seemed primitive, animal-like, a step backward from civilization. Many settlers felt shame about their dugouts, particularly when writing to relatives back east or in Europe. They framed their underground homes as temporary expedients, promising themselves and others that they'd move to proper houses as soon as possible. But practical experience gradually eroded these prejudices. As families survived harsh winters in relative comfort, as they watched neighbours in expensive frame houses struggle with cold and fuel consumption, as they recognized the financial freedom that came from not having a mortgage on a house, attitudes shifted. The dugout began to be seen not as a mark of poverty, but as a mark of good sense, of understanding the plains environment and working with it rather than against it. This cultural shift was never complete. The desire for a frame house remained strong, driven by social pressure, by memories of homes left behind, by the human desire to mark success through visible symbols. But the widespread use of dugouts and sod houses changed how pioneers thought about shelter, about the relationship between humans and their environment, about what was truly necessary versus what was merely conventional. The experience of living underground also changed how settlers thought about the land itself. When your walls were made of soil, when you literally lived inside the earth, you developed a different relationship with the ground. You noticed its temperature, its smell, its texture. You became aware of the living things that inhabited soil, from earthworms to insects to the roots of grass that poked through your walls. This intimacy with earth influenced agricultural practices, making farmers more aware of soil health, more conscious of conservation, more respectful of the medium that fed them and sheltered them. Looking back from our modern perspective, the choice to build underground seems both obvious and radical. Obvious because the practical advantages were so clear. Radical because it required abandoning deeply held cultural assumptions about proper housing. The pioneers who made this choice demonstrated a pragmatism and adaptability that would define successful settlement of the plains. They were willing to look foolish, to violate convention, to live in ways their ancestors would have found appalling, all in service of survival in a new and challenging environment. This willingness to adapt, to try unconventional solutions, to learn from the land itself rather than imposing preconceived notions upon it, represents perhaps the most important lesson of the dugout story. The settlers who thrived on the plains were those who learned to read their environment, to work with its characteristics rather than fighting against them, to find solutions in the resources at hand rather than mourning the resources they'd left behind. The dugout embodied this adaptive approach, turning what seemed like a disadvantage, the lack of building materials, into an advantage by using the most abundant resource of all, the earth itself. When pioneers spoke of building a dugout, they were actually referring to several distinct types of earth-sheltered homes, each adapted to specific terrain and circumstances. Understanding these variations reveals how settlers learned to read their landscape, assessing subtle features to determine which building approach would serve them best. The type of shelter built depended on available terrain, soil conditions, the size of the family, the season of arrival, and the resources at hand. Each type had distinct advantages and challenges, and the choice between them could significantly impact a family's comfort and chances of survival through brutal plains winters. The full dugout, sometimes called a pit dugout, was the simplest and fastest form of earth shelter to construct. This structure was built by excavating a rectangular pit directly into level ground or into a gentle slope. The pit typically measured between 12 and 20 feet long, 8 to 12 feet wide, and 6 to 8 feet deep. These dimensions provided enough space for a small family, while keeping the excavation manageable for a man working alone or with minimal help. The depth was crucial. Too shallow and the structure lacked adequate insulation. Too deep an excavation became exhausting, while also increasing the risk of groundwater seepage. Building a full dugout began with selecting a site where the water table was known to be deep, often on slightly elevated ground where natural drainage would carry water away from the structure. The excavation work itself was back-breaking. Using only hand tools, primarily a spade and possibly a pick if the soil was compacted, the settler would remove thousands of cubic feet of earth. This dirt wasn't wasted. It would be used to build up the low walls that extended above ground level, providing space for windows. The floor of a full dugout was usually earthen, simply the bottom of the excavation smoothed and tamped firm. Some settlers invested the extra effort to lay a floor of flat stones or wooden boards, but this was rare in the early period when every resource had to be carefully rationed. The earthen floor would be swept daily and occasionally sprinkled with water to keep dust down. Over time, the constant foot traffic packed the earth as hard as concrete, creating a surprisingly durable surface. The walls of the pit were the excavated earth itself, left in their natural state or sometimes reinforced with flat stones if available. The front wall, which would contain the door and any windows, extended upward from ground level using sod bricks, or, if available, logs or planks. This wall typically rose 2 to 3 feet above ground, creating space for a door and small windows that would admit precious light into the dim interior. The other 3 walls remained below ground, surrounded by earth that provided both structural support and insulation. Roofing a full dugout required some timber, one of the few external materials necessary for construction. The settler would lay poles or rough-cut lumber across the width of the pit, spacing them about 2 feet apart. These served as primary support beams, bearing the weight of everything above. Across these beams, perpendicular to them, would go a layer of lighter material, perhaps willow branches, small saplings, or split planks if available. This secondary layer had to be close-spaced to prevent the roofing material from falling through. On top of this wooden framework came a layer of prairie grass, laid thick and preferably still in the sod form, creating a dense mat. Over the grass went several inches of earth, packed down firmly but not so heavily as to overload the roof structure. The finished roof would be nearly level with the surrounding ground, making the home nearly invisible from a distance. Grass would grow on the roof come spring, helping to bind the soil and creating natural waterproofing as the living grass roots formed a dense water-shedding surface. The half-dugout, also called a semi-dugout, represented an intermediate form that addressed some of the limitations of the full dugout while remaining relatively simple to construct. Instead of excavating on level ground, the builder selected a hillside or the bank of a ravine, typically choosing a south or east-facing slope to maximize sunlight exposure and minimize snow accumulation. The excavation cut horizontally into the slope, creating a room that was backed by earth on 3 sides while the front wall stood free and above ground. This design offered several significant advantages. The elevated front wall allowed for larger windows, admitting more light than the limited window space of a full dugout. The hillside location provided superior drainage, as water would naturally flow around and past the structure rather than potentially pooling against walls. The roof could be simpler, as one side rested directly on the hillside rather than requiring support all around, and the structure was less likely to flood, a critical advantage in regions where sudden storms could turn dry creeks into raging torrents. Building a half dugout required careful site selection. The ideal hillside had a gentle slope, perhaps 20 to 30 degrees, enough to provide good drainage without being so steep as to risk collapse during excavation. The soil needed to be stable enough to stand in a vertical or near-vertical cut without immediate cave-in, yet not so rocky as to make excavation impossible with hand tools. Clay-rich soils were ideal. They held their shape when cut and provided good water resistance once packed and dried. The excavation process for a half dugout began by marking out the footprint of the structure on the hillside, then carefully cutting back into the slope. The worker would remove soil in layers, starting from the top and working down, shaping the back wall and side walls to meet at roughly right angles. The floor would be sloped slightly toward the open front to encourage water drainage. Particular attention was paid to the ceiling, which had to be carved from the hillside at a height that provided adequate headroom, typically 6.5 to 7 feet, while leaving enough earth above for insulation and structural stability. The front wall of a half dugout was substantial, often built from sod blocks laid in courses like masonry, or constructed from logs if available. This wall bore significant structural load, supporting the front edge of the roof while also framing the door and windows. The craftsmanship of this front wall often determined the success or failure of the entire structure. A poorly built front wall might bulge under the weight of the roof, causing gaps that admitted wind and water. A well-built wall would stand for years, maintaining its shape and providing secure anchoring points for door and window frames. The roof of a half dugout typically sloped from back to front, with the back edge resting on, or slightly into the hillside while the front edge rested on the front wall. This single slope design, simpler than the dual slope or flat roof of a full dugout, shed water more effectively and required less complex carpentry. The same layering technique applied, wooden beams for primary support, lighter wood or brush for secondary structure, prairie grass or sod for waterproofing, and finally earth for insulation and additional water resistance. The sod house, while not technically a dugout, shared many characteristics with underground shelters, and often represented the next step up in quality from the basic dugout. A sod house was built entirely above ground, with walls made from sod blocks cut from the prairie. These structures required no excavation, but demanded far more labor, as hundreds or even thousands of sod blocks had to be cut, transported and laid to create walls. The advantage was a structure that felt more like a conventional house, with better light and ventilation, while still providing the superior insulation that made earth-sheltered homes so comfortable. Building a sod house began with cutting the sod blocks themselves, a specialized task that required skill and appropriate tools. The ideal time for cutting sod was spring, after the ground had thawed, and when the soil held optimal moisture, neither too dry and crumbly nor too wet and heavy. The cutting was typically done with a breaking plough, which turned up ribbons of sod about 18 inches wide and 4 inches thick. These ribbons were then cut into blocks roughly 2 feet long, creating manageable pieces that one person could lift, though each block weighed 40 to 50 pounds. The sod blocks were laid like bricks, with careful attention to bonding patterns that would create stable walls. The first course was laid directly on the ground, sometimes on a shallow foundation of stones if available. Each subsequent course was laid with joints offset from the course below, creating interlocking structure that distributed weight and resisted cracking. The walls were typically built with a double thickness of blocks, creating walls 16 to 20 inches thick that provided remarkable insulation value. As the walls rose, spaces were left for door and window frames, which were set in place and the sod built around them. The walls weren't built perfectly vertical, but with a slight inward slope, perhaps an inch or two per foot of height, creating a structure that was wider at the base than the top. This helped with stability and water shedding. The walls of a typical sod house rose about 7 feet, providing adequate interior headroom while keeping the structure low enough to minimize wind resistance. The roof of a sod house was its most challenging element and the place where most builders compromised their commitment to sod construction. A roof made entirely of sod required substantial internal support, as the weight of earth and grass overhead could easily exceed a ton. Most builders used wood for the roof structure, creating a frame of poles or lumber that could support the weight of sod roofing. The roof would be covered with layers similar to a dugout roof, wood framework, brush or grass, and finally sod. Some sod house builders, particularly those who came later when resources were more available, opted for shingled roofs that were lighter and less prone to leaking. These hybrid structures, with sod walls and wooden roofs, represented a middle ground between the pure earth shelter tradition and conventional frame construction. They maintained the thermal advantages of thick sod walls while avoiding the leakage problems that plagued sod roofs. A variation on the standard sod house was the 2-story sod structure, a relative rarity but not unknown on the plains. These ambitious projects required exceptional skill in sod construction, as the walls had to bear not just roof weight, but also the weight of an entire second story. The walls of such structures were built thicker at the base, sometimes 3 blocks wide instead of 2, and the sod was carefully selected for maximum structural integrity. The second story typically used lighter construction, sometimes frame and board walls rather than additional sod to reduce weight. The specific type of shelter chosen by a pioneer family depended on numerous factors that had to be assessed and balanced. Terrain was primary. Families settling in hilly or broken country naturally gravitated toward half dugouts that took advantage of slopes, while those on flatter ground had to resort to full dugouts or sod houses. The season of arrival mattered greatly. A family arriving in autumn with winter approaching would opt for the fastest possible shelter, typically a basic full dugout, while those arriving in spring might take time to build a more elaborate half dugout or even a sod house. Available labour influenced the decision. A man working alone might excavate a full dugout, but would struggle to cut and lay the hundreds of sod blocks needed for a sod house. A family with several grown sons, or neighbours who organised communal building efforts, could accomplish in days what would take weeks for a solitary worker. The cultural background of the settlers also played a role. Immigrants from regions with earth shelter traditions were more comfortable with full dugouts, while those from Western European backgrounds often pushed towards sod houses that felt more like proper homes. The intended permanence of the shelter affected the type chosen. A family that viewed their first home as strictly temporary, a shelter to see them through one season before building something better, would invest minimal effort in a basic pit dugout. Those who understood they might live in their initial shelter for years, or who lacked resources to ever build something more elaborate, invested greater effort in half dugouts or sod houses that would be more livable for extended periods. The size of the family was another critical consideration. A young couple without children could manage in a very small dugout, perhaps only 10 by 12 feet. A family with several children needed more space, pushing toward larger excavations or sod houses with room for multiple sleeping areas. Some families built compounds, with an initial small dugout later supplemented by additional dugouts or sod structures, creating a cluster of connected spaces that provided room for growth. Local soil conditions determined what was even possible. Sandy soil wouldn't hold together well enough for sod cutting and might collapse during dugout excavation. Rocky soil made excavation nearly impossible with hand tools. Clay-rich soil with good grass cover was ideal for both dugouts and sod construction. Settlers quickly learned to read soil types, understanding which would work for which purposes. This knowledge, often gained through trial and costly error, became part of the collective wisdom shared among pioneer communities. Water table depth was crucial for full dugouts. In areas where groundwater ran close to the surface, excavating below grade meant creating a sump that would fill with water. Families who failed to recognize this risk found their dugouts flooded, sometimes permanently, forcing them to abandon structures they'd worked hard to build. Half dugouts on hillsides largely avoided this problem, as did sod houses built entirely above ground. But full dugouts in low-lying areas were essentially guaranteed to flood unless the water table was quite deep. The various types of underground and earth-sheltered homes weren't mutually exclusive. Many homesteads evolved through multiple phases. A family might start in a small full dugout, the fastest possible shelter. The next season they might build a half dugout into a hillside, moving up in comfort and space. Eventually they might build a sod house, moving above ground while maintaining earth shelter's thermal advantages. Finally, if they succeeded economically, they might build a frame house, though some families who'd learned to love their sod houses remained in them, even when they could afford conventional homes. Each type of shelter told a story about the family who built it, their resources, their skills, their priorities, and their understanding of the environment they'd come to inhabit. The rough pit dugout spoke of desperation, of people who arrived too late in the season and had to dig fast to have any shelter before winter. The carefully crafted half dugout spoke of planning, of people who'd taken time to study their land and build thoughtfully. The sod house spoke of ambition, of families who'd moved beyond mere survival to think about comfort and permanence. Walking the Nebraska or Kansas prairie today, knowing what to look for, you can still find traces of these structures. Depressions in hillsides mark where half dugouts once sheltered families. Rectangular indentations in level ground show where full dugouts were excavated. Low mounds of earth, partially collapsed, reveal where sod houses once stood. These subtle marks on the landscape are monuments to human adaptation, physical evidence of people who learned to make homes from nothing but earth and grass, who survived and often thrived in underground shelters that kept them safe through brutal winters that would have killed them in any other structure. The difference between success and failure, between comfort and misery, between a shelter that would last for years and one that would collapse in months, often came down to site selection. The pioneers who thrived were those who learned to read the land, to see beyond surface appearances, to understand drainage patterns, soil conditions, sun exposure, and wind flow. This knowledge, some brought from old-world experience but much learned through hard trial and error, became the foundation of successful earth shelter construction. The process of selecting a site for a dugout or sod house was more complex than simply finding a convenient location. It required understanding how water moved across and through the landscape, how wind patterns shifted with seasons, how sun angles changed through the year, how soil types varied even within small areas. The settler who took time to observe and analyze before building was far more likely to end up with a comfortable, durable home than one who simply started digging at the most obvious spot. Water management considerations stood foremost in site selection. On the plains, water was both necessity and threat. Too little, and you struggled to meet basic needs for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. Too much, arriving suddenly during spring thaws or summer thunderstorms, could flood your home and destroy your possessions. Understanding how water behaved in the landscape meant the difference between a dry home and a mud pit. The pioneers learned to read subtle topographical features that revealed drainage patterns. They looked for slight elevations, rises of just a few feet that would place a structure above the level where water naturally accumulated. They observed where snow melted first in spring, indicating higher, drier ground. They noted where vegetation patterns changed, as certain plants indicated poorly drained soil, while others suggested better conditions. These signs, invisible to untrained eyes, became clear to settlers who took time to learn their land. For half dugouts, built into hillsides, slope orientation mattered enormously. A south-facing slope received maximum winter sun, making the home brighter and warmer during the coldest months. It also melted snow faster, reducing the risk of moisture seeping into the structure during spring thaw. An east-facing slope caught morning sun and avoided the worst of afternoon heat in summer. North-facing slopes, while cooler in summer, were darker and colder in winter, making them less desirable unless other factors outweighed this disadvantage. The grade of the slope influenced both construction difficulty and long-term stability. A gentle slope, perhaps 15 to 25 degrees, was ideal. Steep enough to provide good drainage and allow excavation into the hillside rather than just into level ground, but not so steep as to risk collapse or make access difficult. Slopes that were too gentle offered little advantage over level ground construction. Slopes that were too steep were difficult to excavate safely, and more prone to erosion that could undermine the structure. Soil composition determined whether a site was even viable for dugout construction. The ideal soil had high clay content, enough to bind together when cut, but not so much as to become imperviously hard when dry, or impossibly sticky when wet. Clay-rich soils held their shape when excavated, allowing near-vertical walls without immediate collapse. They also resisted water infiltration, keeping interiors drier. But pure clay posed problems. It swelled when wet and shrank when dry, potentially cracking walls and creating gaps. Sandy soils were generally poor for dugout construction. They didn't hold their shape well, requiring extensive shoring with timber to prevent collapse. They also allowed water to permeate easily, leading to damp interiors. Homesteaders who tried to build dugouts in sandy soil often found their walls crumbling gradually, the structure becoming unstable within a year or two. Rocky soil presented different challenges. Excavation was exhausting work, requiring picks and pry bars rather than simple shovels, and the rocks themselves could create irregular surfaces difficult to finish neatly. The presence of a subsurface hardpan, a compressed layer of soil that was nearly impermeable to water, could be either advantage or curse depending on its depth. A hardpan located 2 or 3 feet below the surface made an excellent floor base for a full dugout, providing natural water protection. But a shallow hardpan made deep excavation nearly impossible without specialized equipment pioneers rarely possessed. Understanding where hardpan existed and at what depth required digging test holes, time-consuming work that seemed tedious but could save enormous problems later. Groundwater depth was critical for full dugouts excavated into level ground. The water table on the plains varied considerably with location and season, rising during wet periods and dropping during droughts. A dugout excavated during a dry summer might flood the following spring when snowmelt raised the water table. Settlers learned to ask neighbors about water table depths, to observe nearby wells and creeks, to dig test holes and watch how quickly they filled with water. This information guided decisions about how deep to excavate and whether to attempt a full dugout at all. Proximity to water sources influenced site selection, though this had to be balanced against flood risk. Being near a creek meant easier access to water for household needs and for livestock. But creek bottoms were prone to flooding, and building too close meant risking a catastrophic flood that could fill a dugout with water and mud. The wise settler built within reasonable distance of water, perhaps a quarter mile, close enough for convenient access but far enough to avoid flood risk. Sun exposure calculations required understanding how solar angles change through the year. In winter, when the sun tracked low across the southern sky, a dugout entrance facing south received precious direct sunlight that warmed the interior and lifted spirits during dark months. In summer, when the sun climbed high overhead, the same southern exposure admitted less direct sun, helping keep interiors cool. This seasonal variation meant south-facing entrances provided passive solar benefit year-round. East-facing entrances caught morning sun, pleasant in winter but potentially harsh in summer, when the low morning sun shone directly into the dwelling. West-facing entrances avoided morning sun but received afternoon heat in summer, often undesirable on the hot plains. North-facing entrances received almost no direct sun at any season, making them the darkest and coldest option, chosen only when other factors made different orientations impossible. Wind patterns shaped daily life on the plains so profoundly that considering them in site selection was essential. The prevailing winds came from the west and northwest, bringing weather systems across the plains. Winter winds from the north carried Arctic air masses that dropped temperatures precipitously. Summer winds from the south brought heat from the Gulf of Mexico. Understanding these patterns influenced both site selection and the orientation of structures. For half dugouts, excavating into the lee side of a hill, the side sheltered from prevailing winds, meant the entrance was naturally protected from the strongest weather. A dugout opening that faced into prevailing winds would be buffeted constantly, making the door hard to keep sealed, allowing wind-driven snow and rain to enter, and increasing heat loss in winter. Proper orientation relative to wind could mean the difference between a comfortable home and one where wind was a constant presence. Natural windbreaks, though rare on the plains, were highly valued when found. A grove of trees along a creek, a rock outcropping, even a substantial hill could provide wind protection that made a site far more comfortable. Settlers fought over locations with natural wind protection, understanding their value. Those who secured such sites often built frame houses there, saving the windbreak advantage for structures that needed it most, while using more exposed sites for dugouts that were naturally wind-resistant. The presence of building materials nearby affected site selection, particularly for sod houses. The best sod for building came from virgin prairie that had never been ploughed, where grass roots had decades or centuries to create a tight mat binding the soil. A site located in or adjacent to such undisturbed prairie meant sod blocks could be cut immediately adjacent to where they'd be used, minimizing transportation. Given that each block weighed 50 pounds and hundreds were needed, reducing transportation distance saved enormous labor. For dugouts that required some timber for roof supports and door frames, proximity to the few wooded areas was valuable. Cottonwood groves along creeks provided the nearest timber on much of the plains. A homestead within hauling distance of such timber could obtain needed wood without impossible journeys. Those far from any timber source had to make do with minimal wood, creating dugouts with brush-supported roofs that were less durable than those with proper timber. The presence of flat stones influenced construction quality, especially for half-dugouts where stone could line walls, preventing erosion and collapse. Limestone outcroppings in Kansas and southeastern Nebraska provided valuable building stone. Settlers lucky enough to homestead near such deposits had materials to improve their dugouts significantly. They could line excavated walls with dry stacked stone, create stone front walls instead of sod, even build stone fire surrounds that directed heat efficiently and reduced fire risk. Defensive considerations, though less critical than in earlier frontier periods, still influenced site selection. A location with good sight lines allowed residents to see approaching visitors, whether friendly neighbors or potential threats. Heights provided natural defensive advantage. Locations near other homesteads, within sight or shouting distance, offered security through proximity to help if needed. These factors mattered less by the 1870s and 1880s than they had during earlier frontier periods, but they weren't completely ignored. The broader landscape context affected site selection through considerations of future expansion and development. A site that worked well for an initial dugout might be poorly suited for the frame house the family hoped to build eventually. Some settlers chose to build their first dugout at the edge of the property they intended to develop, saving the best location for a future permanent home. Others built in the spot they intended to stay, planning to convert the dugout to a root cellar or storm shelter once they could afford to build above it. Community factors influenced decisions as much as physical landscape features. Settlers wanted to be part of a community, to have neighbors within visiting distance, to be able to share labor and resources. The locations of established homesteads influenced where newcomers settled. Families often clustered, creating informal neighborhoods even when homesteads were separated by half a mile or more. These settlement patterns meant social factors sometimes outweighed optimal physical site characteristics. The season when site selection occurred affected what settlers could observe. Those who arrived in summer saw the land in benign conditions and might miss signs of problems that only emerged in winter or during spring rains. The drainage that seemed adequate in dry weather might prove insufficient during snowmelt. The pleasant summer breeze might become a brutal winter wind. Ideally, settlers had time to observe their land through multiple seasons before building, but this luxury was rare. Most had to make quick decisions based on limited observation. Experience, both personal and borrowed from neighbours, gradually refined site selection skills. The failures were often more instructive than successes. The family whose dugout flooded in spring taught the whole community about recognizing drainage problems. The settler whose sod house collapsed taught about unstable soil conditions. This collective knowledge accumulated, passing from established settlers to newcomers, creating an oral tradition of landscape literacy that significantly improved success rates over time. Modern observers might wonder why settlers didn't avoid all these complications by simply building frame houses. The answer lay in economics and available materials. Lumber prices on the plains frontier were often prohibitive, sometimes costing more than a family's entire annual cash income. Even when affordable, transporting lumber across roadless prairie was challenging. Earth shelters used materials available on site at no cost except labor. This fundamental economic reality meant that careful site selection and skilled earth shelter construction offered the only viable path to adequate housing for most homesteading families. The art of reading landscape for dugout sites represented a form of ecological literacy that modern society has largely lost. These settlers had to understand their environment at a level of detail few people today possess about the places they live. They read soil texture by how it felt in their hands, assessed drainage by observing plant communities, predicted water table depths by noting well depths on neighbouring claims, determined sun angles by watching shadows. This intimate knowledge, earned through observation and often through painful mistakes, connected them to their land in ways that transcended mere occupation. Standing on the prairie today, looking at a gentle hillside with good south-facing exposure, stable soil and pleasant drainage, you might see just another piece of grassland. A pioneer family would have seen a potential home site, mentally excavating a half dugout into that slope, calculating how much sod could be cut from the flat ground nearby, noting the creek visible in the distance providing water access without flood risk, observing the grove of cottonwoods that meant timber for roof supports. The ability to see home in raw landscape, to transform observation into habitable space through nothing but labour and skill, defined the successful pioneer. Once a site was selected, the actual work of construction began, a process that tested the physical endurance, ingenuity and determination of pioneer families. Building a dugout was simple in concept but demanding in execution, requiring sustained hard labour, practical problem-solving, and attention to detail that separated successful structures from failures. The techniques employed had been refined through trial and error, with each generation of settlers learning from the mistakes and successes of those who came before. For a full dugout excavated into level ground, construction began with marking out the dimensions on the surface. The settler would drive stakes at the corners of the planned structure, typically laying out a rectangle about 12 to 16 feet long and 8 to 10 feet wide. These dimensions provided enough interior space for basic living while keeping the excavation manageable. A taut string stretched between stakes ensured straight lines and square corners, important for structural stability, even though the rough construction might seem casual. The excavation work was brutally hard, physical labor. Using a simple spade, the builder would begin removing earth, typically starting from one corner and working systematically. The goal was to excavate to a depth of 6 to 8 feet, deep enough to place the floor well below the frost line while providing adequate interior height. An experienced worker might move half a cubic yard of earth per hour under good conditions, meaning a dugout with 1,000 cubic feet of interior space required removing about 1,400 cubic feet of earth, when accounting for the tapered shape of the walls. This meant somewhere between 60 and 80 hours of excavation labor for a man working alone, usually spread over 1 to 2 weeks of full-time work. The physical toll was immense. Blisters formed and broke and formed again on hands gripping the spade handle. Back muscles screamed from the constant bending and lifting. Shoulders ached from throwing shovelfuls of dirt up and out of the deepening pit. The work had to be paced carefully to avoid injury or complete exhaustion. The excavated earth wasn't wasted. It was piled carefully around the perimeter of the pit, particularly on 3 sides where it would later be shaped into low berms that extended the walls slightly above ground level. This provided extra depth to the interior space, without requiring excavation below the optimal floor level, and also helped with drainage by creating a slight lip that directed surface water away from the structure rather than into it. As the pit deepened, the worker had to address the question of wall angles. Perfectly vertical walls looked neat, but were prone to collapse, especially in looser soils. A slight slope, with walls leaning inward maybe 5 degrees from vertical, provided much better stability. This meant the floor area was somewhat smaller than the surface opening, but the trade-off in structural integrity was worthwhile. The corners were particularly important. These needed to be as square as possible, as rounded corners created weak points where walls might buckle. The floor surface required attention beyond simply leveling. The earth was tamped firmly, using either a hand tamper, essentially a heavy flat weight on a pole, or simply by walking over the surface repeatedly in hard-soled boots. The goal was to compress the soil, driving out air pockets and creating a surface that wouldn't develop ruts and holes with use. Some settlers mixed a thin slip of clay and water and spread it over the tamped floor, allowing it to dry into a harder surface, a time-consuming process but one that created a more finished result. Drainage within the dugout was critical. The floor was graded slightly, perhaps an inch or 2 over the length of the structure, sloping toward the entrance. This encouraged any water that did enter to flow out rather than pooling in the back of the space. Some builders excavated a shallow drainage trench just inside the entrance, filling it with stones if available, creating a sump where water could collect before being bailed out. The front wall, the only wall built rather than excavated, required the most skill. This wall had to support the front edge of the roof while also framing the door and any windows. If sod was used, the construction began with cutting the blocks. This was specialized work, usually done with a breaking plough that could turn up long ribbons of sod. The plough, drawn by oxen or horses, would cut a furrow about 18 inches wide and 3 to 4 inches deep, lifting a continuous ribbon of soil bound together by grass roots. These ribbons had to be cut into manageable blocks, typically about 2 feet long. A sharp spade was used to cut through the sod at intervals, creating individual blocks that could be lifted and carried. Each block weighed 40 to 50 pounds, and hundreds would be needed even for the front wall of a modest dugout. The blocks had to be kept moist during construction. If they dried out too much, they became brittle and broke apart. If they stayed too wet, they deformed under their own weight when stacked. Laying sod blocks resembled masonry more than carpentry. The first course was laid directly on the ground, with blocks placed end to end across the width of the front wall. The second course was laid with joints offset from the first, creating a running bond pattern that distributed weight and resisted cracking. Each block was pressed firmly onto the one below, using the weight of the block itself to create adhesion. No mortar was needed. The blocks bonded naturally as the soil compacted. As the wall rose, the builder had to keep it straight and true. A plumb line, just a weight on a string, helped check that the wall wasn't leaning. A level, if available, ensured courses were horizontal. The wall was typically built double thick, 2 rows of sod blocks side by side, creating a wall 16 to 20 inches thick that provided excellent insulation and structural strength. Door and window openings were framed as the wall was built. Rough wooden frames, often made from whatever scraps of lumber the settler had managed to obtain, were set in place, and the sod built around them. The frames had to be strong enough to support the sod above. A weak frame would sag under weight, distorting the opening and creating gaps. The lintel over the door was particularly critical, as this single piece of timber had to span the opening, usually 3 feet or more, while supporting the weight of sod above. For a half dugout excavated into a hillside, the construction process differed in significant ways. The work began by marking out the footprint against the hillside, using the slope itself as a guide for where the back wall would be. The excavation started at the top, cutting into the hillside horizontally, while maintaining enough of a roof of earth above to prevent collapse. This required more skill than excavating a pit in level ground. The worker had to constantly assess the stability of the earth above, watching for cracks or subtle movements that might warn of impending cave-in. The technique involved cutting back into the hill gradually, removing earth in layers, constantly checking that the roof of earth above had adequate thickness. Typically, at least 3 feet of earth needed to remain above the ceiling level to provide structural integrity and insulation. The side walls of a half dugout were natural extensions of the excavated hill, sloping slightly outward as they rose from floor to ceiling. These walls often had irregular surfaces reflecting the natural stratification of the soil. Some builders left these walls rough, while others smoothed them with hand tools, creating more even surfaces that could be finished with whitewash or covered with newspaper or fabric. The back wall was usually left rough as well, though attention had to be paid to preventing erosion. Any loose soil was cleaned away, and sometimes the surface was treated with a thin clay slip to seal it and prevent soil from continually shedding into the living space. The ceiling, carved from the hillside, required particular care. It needed to be smooth enough to prevent constant dirt falls, but not so aggressively worked as to destabilize the earth above. The front wall of a half dugout, like that of a full dugout, was built rather than excavated. The construction technique was essentially identical, using sod blocks or logs if available, creating a wall that enclosed the front of the excavated space. This wall often extended slightly beyond the hillside on both ends, creating small wings that helped keep weather from driving directly into the entrance. Roof construction was where dugout building demanded the most careful work and often the most external materials. The roof had to support substantial weight, up to several tons for a sod-covered roof, while spanning distances of 10 feet or more. This required substantial timbers, increasingly difficult to obtain the farther one travelled onto the treeless plains. The primary roof supports, called beams or joists, were typically logs 6 to 8 inches in diameter, laid across the width of the structure, spacing about 2 feet apart. These were set firmly on the walls, either embedded in the sod of the front wall or resting on plates, long timbers that distributed the weight along the wall length. For a half dugout, the back ends of these beams typically rested against or slightly into the hillside, allowing the earth itself to bear much of the load. Across these primary beams went secondary supports, lighter materials like willow branches, small saplings, or split planks. These were laid close together, perhaps 6 inches apart, perpendicular to the main beams. Their function was to support the roofing material and prevent it from sagging between the main beams. This layer had to be sturdy enough to support a person's weight, as settlers would occasionally need to access the roof for repairs or to scrape off excess grass growth. The next layer was critical for waterproofing. Prairie grass, ideally in sod form where the grass was still rooted in soil, was laid over the secondary supports. This grass layer went on thick, 6 inches or more, creating a dense mat. The grass stems overlapped like shingles on a conventional roof, oriented so water would flow downward and outward rather than being channeled into the structure. If sod pieces were used, they were laid root side up so the roots would help bind the roof together and the soil side would shed water. Over the grass came the final layer of earth, typically 4 to 8 inches thick. This earth provided insulation, added weight that helped hold everything together, and created a surface where grass would grow naturally come spring. The earth was packed down firmly but not compacted so heavily as to crush the grass layer below. The goal was a roof that would settle gradually over the first few months, compacting naturally into a solid, weather-tight surface. The roof slope was important for water management. Most dugout roofs were built with a gentle slope, perhaps a rise of 1 foot over a run of 10 feet, just enough to encourage water to flow off rather than pooling. Too steep a slope and the construction became complicated, potentially allowing the heavy earth layer to slide off. Too flat and water wouldn't drain properly, potentially leaking through into the living space. The junction between the roof and the front wall was a critical detail that separated good construction from poor. This seam was where water would most readily penetrate if not properly sealed. Builders learned to extend the grass roofing layer over the edge of the front wall, creating an overhang that directed water away from the wall face. Some used whatever scraps of tin or wood they could obtain to create a drip edge that positively prevented water from running down the front wall. The entrance required special attention. The door opening, typically small to conserve heat, needed a stout frame set firmly in the front wall. The door itself was built from whatever materials were available, often rough planks or even pieces cut from packing crates. It had to fit tightly enough to keep out wind and weather, but not so tightly as to swell stuck in wet weather. Leather hinges were common when metal couldn't be obtained, and the latch might be nothing more than a wooden bar that dropped into brackets. Windows were luxury items in early dugouts, as glass was expensive and fragile to transport. Many early structures had no windows at all, relying on the open door for light and ventilation. Those who could afford glass typically installed small windows, perhaps 12 by 18 inches, just large enough to admit some light. The window frames were built into the front wall during construction, and the precious glass was installed carefully, often without putty to seal it, just setting the pane in a rabbet in the frame and holding it with thin strips of wood. For ventilation in dugouts without windows, or when windows and doors had to be closed against weather, settlers sometimes installed a chimney-like vent. This was simply a hollow square built up from the roof level, allowing air to enter or exit without opening the door. Such vents were fire hazards if poorly constructed, as they could allow sparks from the cooking fire to reach the combustible roof materials. The entire construction process, from starting excavation to completing the roof, typically took 2 to 4 weeks for a man working full-time with occasional help from family members. This time could stretch much longer if he was simultaneously trying to prepare fields, tend livestock, or handle other essential tasks. Many families lived in wagons or crude tents during the construction period, enduring whatever weather came while working frantically to complete their shelter before winter. The quality of construction varied enormously depending on the builder's skill, available materials, and time pressure. A well-built dugout carefully excavated with stable walls, a stout front wall, and a properly constructed roof could last for years with minimal maintenance. A poorly built structure might begin deteriorating within months, with walls crumbling, roof sagging, and water infiltrating whenever it rained. The difference often came down to attention to detail and willingness to take the time to do things right even when time pressure was intense. The finished dugout might not look like much to modern eyes. It was dim inside, with light only from the small windows and open door. The walls were rough earth, often damp to the touch. The ceiling was low, typically 6.5 to 7 feet, requiring tall people to stoop. The smell was of earth, distinctive and pervasive. But this humble structure represented security, shelter from storms, protection from cold, a space where a family could survive and gradually build toward something better. The same soil that sheltered pioneer families from brutal winters, the prairie sod itself was perhaps the most ingenious building material employed in American frontier history. This sod, despised by farmers trying to break it for planting, celebrated by those who'd learned to build with it, represented a perfect adaptation to environmental constraints. Understanding how sod functioned as a building material, how it was cut and prepared and laid, reveals much about pioneer resourcefulness and their growing understanding of the landscape they inhabited. Prairie sod was unlike anything settlers from forested regions had encountered. It was not simply soil with some grass growing in it. It was a complex biological matrix, the product of thousands of years of grass growth under conditions that discouraged decomposition. Each year's grass growth died back, adding its roots and stubble to accumulating organic matter. But the semi-arid climate of the plains meant this organic material decomposed slowly. The result was soil dense with plant roots, both living and dead, creating a mat of vegetation that could be cut free from the earth beneath it and handled as a solid object. The roots of prairie grasses are remarkable structures. Big blue stem, one of the dominant prairie grasses, sends roots down 6 feet or more seeking moisture during the dry season. Buffalo grass, adapted to the shortest grass regions, has roots that spread horizontally, creating a dense near-surface mat. Indian grass, grama grass, switchgrass, dozens of species each with their own root architecture, combined to create a three-dimensional web of the living tissue permeating the soil. It was this root mass that gave sod its strength and made it viable as a building material. The ideal sod for building came from virgin prairie, land that had never been ploughed. The older the prairie, the better the sod. Land that had supported grass growth for decades or centuries had root development that land ploughed and replanted could never match. This created an odd situation where the very best building material was also the very best farmland, creating tension between immediate needs for shelter and long-term plans for agriculture. Most settlers resolved this by cutting sod from land they didn't plan to farm immediately, preserving their best agricultural land while still obtaining good building material. The season for cutting sod mattered significantly. Spring was ideal, particularly the period after the ground had fully thawed, but before summer heat dried everything out. The soil in spring held optimal moisture content, making it heavy enough to hold together but not so wet as to be unworkable. The grass was actively growing, meaning roots were alive and vigorous, providing maximum binding strength. Summer cutting was possible but less than ideal. Dried sod became brittle and more prone to breaking. Fall cutting could work, but the approaching cold weather limited time for construction before winter. The cutting was typically done with a breaking plough, a specialized piece of equipment designed specifically for turning prairie sod. This plough had a heavy iron share that could penetrate the dense root mass, and a moldboard shape to turn the sod over rather than simply pushing through it. The plough was drawn by a team of oxen or horses, strong animals that could pull against the tremendous resistance the sod presented. The person guiding the plough aimed to cut ribbons about 18 inches wide and 3 to 4 inches deep. Maintaining consistent depth was critical. Too shallow, and the sod lacked structural integrity. Too deep and unnecessary weight and labour resulted. The plough moved slowly, perhaps covering an acre per day under good conditions. Behind the plough came the ribbon of overturned sod, a continuous strip stretching across the field. This ribbon had to be cut into manageable blocks before it dried too much. Workers following the plough would use sharp spades to cut across the ribbon at intervals of about 2 feet, creating individual blocks. These blocks, roughly 2 feet long, 18 inches wide and 4 inches thick, became the standard unit for sod construction. Each block weighed between 40 and 50 pounds when fresh cut, heavy enough to be stable when laid but light enough that a strong person could lift and carry it. Timing was crucial between cutting and using the sod. Ideally, blocks were cut and used within days. Fresh sod was most pliable, easiest to work with, and adhered best to other blocks. If sod had to be stored, it was stacked carefully with grass side to grass side, keeping the soil surfaces exposed so the roots wouldn't knit together. Even so, stored sod didn't perform as well as fresh cut. After a few weeks of storage, the grass began to die, the roots lost strength, and the blocks became more likely to crumble. The quality of sod varied depending on the grass species present. Areas dominated by big blue stem produced sod with deep roots and excellent structural integrity. Buffalo grass areas created sod with a dense surface mat but less depth. Mixed grass prairie offered compromise characteristics. Experienced builders learned to recognize which areas would produce the best sod for their purposes, and they planned cutting accordingly. Soil type influenced sod quality as much as grass species. Clay-rich soils produced sod that held together well and resisted water penetration, ideal characteristics for building. Sandy soils didn't bind as well, producing sod that tended to crumble. The ideal soil had clay content between 20 and 40%, enough to provide cohesion without becoming unworkable when wet. Experienced settlers could assess soil by feel, rubbing a sample between their fingers to gauge clay content. The organic matter content of the soil affected sod quality significantly. Soil rich in organic matter, dark brown or nearly black in color, produced sod with more binding from organic materials in addition to the physical binding from roots. This organic-rich sod was also more fertile, creating walls that would sometimes grow grass even after being laid up in a wall, though this wasn't always desirable as the growing grass could work roots deeper and potentially destabilize the wall. Using sod as a building material required understanding how it would change over time. Fresh-cut sod was relatively soft, slightly flexible, could be shaped somewhat with hand pressure. As it dried, it became harder, more rigid, less workable. This drying process was gradual over weeks and months. A properly constructed sod wall would settle and compress over the first few months, the individual blocks slowly knitting together into a monolithic mass. The settling process had to be anticipated during construction. Builders typically made walls slightly higher than the desired final height, knowing they would settle. Door and window frames were built with extra clearance above, sometimes several inches, so settling wouldn't bind them. The roof structure had to accommodate this compression, either through flexible connections or by accepting that there would be some separation between wall top and roof as the wall settled. Water interaction with sod was complex. Sod blocks would shed light rain quite effectively. The grass covering and the clay in the soil created a surface that water beaded on rather than penetrating. But heavy sustained rain would eventually saturate sod, causing it to swell and become heavy. The quality of construction determined whether this was a problem. Well-laid sod walls would absorb some water but remain structurally sound. Poorly laid walls might slump or even collapse when saturated. The insulation value of sod walls was one of their greatest advantages. Sod walls 18 to 24 inches thick provided R values, the measure of thermal resistance, far superior to the wooden walls pioneers could afford to build. The combination of soil, organic matter, trapped air spaces and moisture content created a material that resisted heat transfer remarkably well. This meant dugouts and sod houses stayed cool in summer and warm in winter with minimal energy input for heating or cooling. The thermal mass effect enhanced the insulation value. The sheer weight of sod walls meant they stored significant thermal energy. Once warmed, they released that heat slowly over many hours. Once cooled, they remained cool for extended periods. This thermal mass moderated temperature swings, keeping interiors stable even when outside temperatures fluctuated wildly. The daily temperature variation inside a sod house might be 10 degrees, while outside it could be 40 or more. Sound insulation was another unexpected benefit. Sod walls, thick and dense, blocked sound remarkably well. This created interior spaces that were quiet even when wind howled outside, a psychological comfort that shouldn't be underestimated. The sounds from inside, conversations and daily activities, didn't carry far beyond the walls, providing privacy even in areas where neighbors were relatively close. Sod as a roofing material presented different challenges than sod for walls. Roof sod had to resist not just compression from above, but also erosion from water flowing across its surface. The sod used for roofing was often cut slightly differently, sometimes thinner, and always oriented to maximize water shedding. The grass was kept longer rather than being trimmed short, as the grass stems helped channel water off the roof. The living nature of sod roofs created both advantages and problems. The grass would continue growing, especially in spring and summer, creating a thick mat that enhanced waterproofing. But the roots could work their way through the structure beneath, potentially finding gaps in the roof framework and creating leak paths. Excessive grass growth added weight that could strain the roof structure. Settlers learned they had to occasionally cut or burn the grass on their roofs to keep it from becoming problematic. Grass fires, common on the plains, pose special threat to sod roof structures. While the roofs wouldn't burn in the conventional sense, a fire could kill the grass, destroying the living roots that helped bind the roof together. After a fire passed over a sod roof, the dead grass would decompose rapidly, weakening the roof and creating leak problems within weeks or months. Structures that survived the fire itself might fail later due to roof degradation. Animals interacting with sod structures created ongoing challenges. Mice burrowed through sod walls with ease, creating galleries that could undermine structural integrity, while also providing entry points for more mice. Badgers and ground squirrels sometimes excavated into sod walls from outside. Cows and horses would rub against sod walls, gradually eroding them. Some settlers surrounded their structures with ditches or piled rocks against the lower portions of walls to discourage animal damage. The aesthetic qualities of sod structures were complex. Fresh built, they looked raw and crude, obviously earthen. Over the first year, as grass grew on the roof and the walls weathered, they took on a more finished appearance, almost seeming to grow from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. Some settlers appreciated this organic quality, while others found it primitive and embarrassing. The perception was as much about cultural values as objective assessment. The durability of sod structures surprised many observers. Well-built sod houses could last 20 years or more with reasonable maintenance. The walls, once fully settled and dried, became almost as hard as adobe. They resisted weather remarkably well, needing only occasional patching where erosion created weak spots. The roofs required more maintenance, needing to be reworked every few years as grass died back and new growth didn't adequately replace it. Eventually, time and weather would defeat even the best sod structure. The organic materials would decompose, the grass roots that bound everything together would decay, and the structure would gradually slump back into the earth it had been cut from. Abandoned sod houses dissolved within a decade, sometimes faster, leaving only rectangular depressions and slight mounds to mark where families had lived. This impermanence meant that few sod structures survived into the modern era, making them difficult to study and preserving them primarily through photographs and written accounts. Understanding sod as a building material requires appreciating it as a living system adapted to local conditions. The pioneers who learned to work with sod, who understood its properties and used them effectively, were engaging in a sophisticated form of bioarchitecture, using living materials in ways that maximize their beneficial properties while minimizing problems. This knowledge, largely lost as building materials became industrialized, represents important historical wisdom about sustainable construction and working with, rather than against, natural systems. Stepping inside a pioneer dugout meant entering a world utterly unlike what most modern people have ever experienced. This was home carved from earth, where walls were soil, ceilings were held up by rough timber, and every aspect of daily life was shaped by living partially or entirely underground. Understanding what life was actually like in these spaces, how families organized their days, what challenges they faced, what comforts they created, reveals both the hardship and the ingenuity of frontier existence. The first impression upon entering a dugout was always the dimness. Even on the brightest summer day, the interior remained shadowy, with light only from the small windows and the open door. Eyes needed time to adjust when coming in from brilliant prairie sunshine. This perpetual dimness affected everything, from the timing of daily tasks to the psychological state of residents. Work requiring good light, sewing or reading, had to be done near windows or by the door during daylight hours. Evening hours were truly dark, illuminated only by firelight or the weak glow of precious candles or oil lamps. The smell was omnipresent and distinctive, earthy and slightly damp. This wasn't necessarily unpleasant. Many residents grew to associate the earth smell with home, with safety and comfort. But it was inescapable, permeating clothing and hair, becoming part of the sensory signature of dugout life. Visitors could always tell when someone lived in a dugout by this characteristic smell that clung to them and their possessions. The temperature inside a dugout felt remarkably different from outside conditions. In summer, when prairie heat climbed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, making outdoor work almost unbearable, stepping into a dugout meant entering coolness. The temperature inside might be 30 or 40 degrees lower than outside, perhaps 65 or 70 degrees, comfortable without any artificial cooling. This natural air conditioning was one of the dugout's greatest advantages, making summer survival bearable when work demanded long hours in scorching heat. Winter brought the opposite effect, but equally dramatic. When blizzards drove temperatures far below zero, when wind chill made outside conditions instantly deadly, the dugout interior remained relatively warm. With a small fire, the temperature might be maintained at 55 to 65 degrees, comfortable enough for ordinary activities. The earth walls and roof absorbed heat and released it slowly, moderating temperature swings. A fire that died during the night wouldn't result in immediate freezing, as it would in a poorly insulated frame house. The space inside was cramped by any standard. A typical dugout measuring 12 by 16 feet provided 192 square feet of floor space, about the size of a modern bedroom, but this single room had to accommodate everything a family did. Sleeping, cooking, eating, work, storage, socializing, all happened in this one small space. For a family of 4 or 5 or more, the crowding was intense. Privacy was impossible. Every activity affected everyone else. Furniture had to be minimal and multifunctional. A table might serve for meal preparation, eating, and as a work surface for crafts or repairs. Benches around the table doubled as seating and storage if built with lift-up seats. The bed, typically shared by parents while children slept on pallets on the floor, was often built against one wall, saving floor space. Some families built bunk bed arrangements against the walls, creating sleeping tiers that maximized use of vertical space. Storage was a constant challenge. Food supplies, tools, clothing, all the necessities of life had to be organized within the tiny space. Shelves were built wherever they'd fit, hung from walls or suspended from ceiling beams. Goods were stored in barrels and crates and trunks, stacked and fitted together like puzzle pieces. The settlers learned to be organized by necessity. In such tight quarters, disorganization meant chaos. The cooking arrangement centered on a stove if the family could afford one, a precious piece of equipment that provided both cooking capability and heat. The stove was positioned centrally or along one wall, with the stovepipe venting through the roof. When a stove wasn't available, cooking happened at a fireplace built into one end wall, with the chimney dug up through the earth or built against the front wall. Food preparation was constant work. Every meal required starting from basic ingredients, mixing and cooking from scratch. No convenience foods or quick options existed. Water management presented daily challenges. Water had to be carried from a source, perhaps a creek or well some distance away. It was too precious to waste, so washing and cleaning were done sparingly. Dishwater might be used to scrub the floor before being thrown out. Laundry was a major undertaking, requiring heating large quantities of water, done perhaps once a week or less frequently in winter when water was harder to obtain. The earthen floor, despite being tamped hard, created continual housekeeping challenges. Dirt tracked in from outside, dust fell from the ceiling. The floor itself generated fine particles that coated everything. Sweeping was daily necessity, with the swept dirt simply pushed out the door. Some families spread canvas or rugs over parts of the floor, providing cleaner surfaces for food preparation or sleeping. But these textiles were expensive luxuries most couldn't afford initially. The ceiling was a constant source of minor annoyance and occasional hazard. Dirt would work loose from between the roof poles, sifting down onto whatever was beneath. Insects lived in the ceiling, along with mice, and occasionally these creatures would fall into the living space. Some families tacked muslin sheets to the ceiling, creating a fabric barrier that caught falling dirt and creatures. This helped, but required occasional cleaning when the accumulated debris in the fabric became heavy. Snakes finding their way into dugouts was reality rather than horror story. The cool spaces attracted snakes seeking relief from summer heat, and the numerous mouse populations provided food that drew them. Most were harmless species, bull snakes and garter snakes, but rattlesnakes sometimes appeared as well. Residents learned to check their spaces before reaching into dim corners, to shake out clothing and bedding before use, to be perpetually aware that they shared their home with creatures who'd inhabited this ground long before humans dug into it. The constant dampness affected stored goods and clothing. Items made of leather would mildew if not cared for properly. Paper would curl and discolor. Clothing never seemed to dry completely, especially in winter when wet things couldn't be hung outside. The smell of mildew mingled with earth smell, creating an olfactory environment that visiting neighbors from frame houses found unpleasant, but that residents grew accustomed to. Sleep quality suffered in various ways from dugout conditions. The beds were often nothing more than wooden frames with rope springs, mattresses stuffed with prairie grass or corn husks, providing poor cushioning and constantly generating rustling sounds with every movement. The air quality could be poor when the dugout was sealed against cold, with minimal ventilation and smoke from the cooking fire adding to stuffiness. But the quiet and darkness and stable temperature also enhanced sleep in some ways. The earth surrounding the space deadened external sounds. No wind noise came through walls. Animals moving about outside were inaudible. The darkness was absolute when fire and lamps were extinguished, creating conditions for deep sleep. Family dynamics were intensely affected by the cramped quarters. Tensions that might be relieved in a larger house by family members moving to separate rooms couldn't be escaped in a single-room dugout. Arguments had no private space. Parents couldn't have confidential discussions away from children's ears. Adolescents had no space for the privacy their developmental needs craved. The social pressure to maintain harmony, to control anger and frustration was intense, because there was simply nowhere to go to cool off or be alone. Winter confinement amplified these challenges. When weather made going outside dangerous, families might be trapped together in their small space for days or even weeks. The psychological strain was significant. Children grew restless, their energy demanding release that was impossible in the tiny space. Adults struggled with the monotony and confinement. Many pioneer accounts mention the relief of the first day after a storm, when it was finally possible to go outside, to have space, to escape the oppressive closeness. The cultural activities families developed to cope with confinement revealed remarkable creativity. Storytelling became primary entertainment, with parents recounting tales from their own childhoods, reading from the few books they possessed, or inventing stories. Songs were sung, often the same repertoire repeated endlessly, because their collection was limited. Simple games were played with stones or carved pieces. Children learned crafts and skills from parents, not just for education but to fill empty hours. The ability to find satisfaction in simple activities, to create entertainment from nothing, became essential survival skill, as important as knowing how to preserve food or build a fire. Religious observance for faithful families happened in this same cramped space. The Bible was read, prayers were said, Sundays were marked as different from other days, even when work still demanded attention. The dugout served as church for families too isolated to reach community services, a sacred space despite being literally a hole in the ground. Some families maintained this spiritual dimension carefully, seeing their dugout as blessed space where God's presence dwelt with them. The seasonal rhythms of life in a dugout created distinct periods with different characteristics. Summer meant the door could stay open much of the time, providing ventilation and light and a sense of connection to the outside world. Meals might be taken outside. Work could flow between indoor and outdoor spaces. The dugout served primarily as sleeping quarters and storage, with daytime life happening mostly outdoors. Autumn brought gradual sealing of the space as temperatures dropped. Windows that had been left open needed to be closed. The door stayed shut more often. The focus shifted inward. Food storage became priority as winter stores were accumulated and organized within the limited space. The coming winter cast psychological shadow, families preparing mentally as well as physically for months of confinement. Winter was the period when the dugout's advantages and disadvantages were both most pronounced. The warmth and protection were life-saving, but the confinement and darkness were oppressive. The stable temperature was wonderful, but the stuffiness from sealed space and smoke was unpleasant. The quiet and peace were restful, but the isolation from the broader world was psychologically challenging. Winter in a dugout was survived as much as lived. Spring brought tremendous relief, almost a rebirth. As temperatures moderated, the door could be opened. Fresh air flowed through. Light returned. The winter's accumulated stuffiness and cabin fever could be released. Families emerged to find their world transformed, winter's white giving way to spring green. The dugout transitioned back to being primarily storage and sleeping space as life moved outdoors again. The social stigma of living in a dugout affected residents' psychological state significantly. When visitors came from frame houses, the contrast was stark and embarrassing. When letters arrived from relatives back east or in Europe, describing their homes, the comparison to a hole in the ground was painful. Children sometimes felt shame when they learned how other families lived. The dream of moving up and out, of someday having a proper house, sustained many families through years of dugout living. Yet paradoxically, many residents developed genuine affection for their dugouts. The structures that had sheltered them through harsh winters, that had kept them safe when tornadoes passed overhead, that had been affordable when frame houses weren't, earned a place in family history. Years later, people who'd grown up in dugouts would remember them fondly, recognizing the hardships but also the coziness, the sense of being held by the earth itself, the intimacy of family life in that small space. The health impacts of dugout living were mixed. The stable temperature and protection from weather extremes were beneficial, reducing exposure that could lead to illness. But the poor ventilation, the dampness, the constant exposure to soil microbes and dust created respiratory challenges. Tuberculosis thrived in poorly ventilated spaces. Mold spores and bacteria from damp earth caused various ailments. Families with members who had respiratory sensitivities often struggled more in dugouts than they would have in better ventilated frame houses. The particular vulnerability of infants and young children in dugouts was a source of constant worry. The floors were breeding grounds for bacteria. The inability to maintain sterile conditions meant every cut or scrape risked infection. The cold floor surfaces where babies crawled and toddlers played contributed to respiratory infections. Many pioneer accounts mention children dying in infancy, losses attributed to various causes, but often linked to the challenging living conditions. Women particularly felt the burden of maintaining household standards in dugout conditions. The cultural expectations of the time demanded that homes be clean, food be prepared properly, clothing be maintained, all the domestic arts that defined female competence. Achieving these standards in an earthen dugout was enormously difficult. The dirt, the dampness, the dimness, all conspired against conventional housekeeping. Women developed remarkable skills at making do, at creating cleanliness and order in spaces that seemed to resist such efforts. The transition out of a dugout, when families finally built frame houses or sod houses with multiple rooms and above-ground construction, was usually celebrated but also sometimes bittersweet. The new house offered space and light and the social status of proper housing, but it also meant higher costs for heating, less stable temperatures, more vulnerability to storms. Some families, accustomed to the dugout's particular advantages, found the transition harder than expected. Others never looked back, grateful to leave behind what they saw as primitive conditions. Looking at dugout life from our modern perspective, it's easy to focus on the hardships and miss the adaptations and successes. These families survived and often thrived in conditions we'd find intolerable. They raised children who grew to adulthood, maintained family bonds under stress that would break many modern families, found joy and meaning in lives that had very few material comforts. The resourcefulness, resilience and determination required to make a life in a dugout exceeded what most of us are ever called upon to demonstrate. These were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, discovering reserves of strength they'd never known they possessed. when the blizzard screamed across the open prairie and temperatures plummeted to levels that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes, the underground shelters of pioneer families became refuges where survival depended on preparation, vigilance, and an intimate knowledge of how to coax warmth from limited resources. Winter survival in a dugout wasn't simply about staying alive. It was about maintaining health, morale, and the daily routines that kept a family functioning through months of isolation and hardship. The strategies employed combined traditional wisdom brought from other climates, knowledge borrowed from native peoples and earlier settlers, and hard-won lessons learned through trial and error, sometimes fatal error. Preparation began long before winter's first snow. As summer faded into autumn, prudent families shifted their focus from farming to winter readiness. The first priority was fuel. Without adequate fuel to maintain fire through long dark months, survival was unlikely. On the treeless plains, fuel meant different things than it did in forested regions. Buffalo chips, the dried droppings of the great herds that had recently roamed these grasslands, were gathered the wagon load. These chips, sun-dried and light, burned surprisingly well, providing steady heat though less intense than wood. Children often had the task of gathering buffalo chips, sent out with wagons or baskets to scour the prairie for this precious resource. It was unglamorous work, handling dried manure but essential for survival. Families would accumulate massive piles of chips, stacked against the dugout's exterior, or stored under shelter where they'd stay dry. A winter's supply might fill several wagon loads, tons of material that represented hundreds of hours of gathering labour. Where timber existed along creeks and rivers, gathering firewood was back-breaking work that consumed weeks of autumn labour. Dead trees had to be located, felled if still standing, cut to length, split, and hauled to the homestead. The wood would be stacked carefully where air could circulate, allowing it to dry and season. Green wood, not fully dried, burned poorly and created excessive smoke, but sometimes necessity demanded burning whatever was available. Some families supplemented with twisted hay, bundles of prairie grass wound into tight shapes that burned quickly, but provided temporary heat for specific tasks like cooking. Making hay twists was winter work often done by women and children, providing activity during long confined days while also creating supplementary fuel. The technique required practice. Twists needed to be tight enough to burn steadily, but not so compressed as to smother. Each twist represented a few minutes of burning time, meaning hundreds were needed for daily cooking alone. Coal, where it could be obtained, was prized for its concentrated heat. But coal was expensive and had to be hauled from distant sources, making it largely unavailable to homesteading families without cash reserves. Those who could afford even small quantities of coal hoarded it for the coldest periods, when buffalo chips and wood couldn't provide sufficient heat alone. Food storage was equally critical to winter survival. The growing season on the plains was short, providing a limited window for producing the food that would sustain a family through 7 or 8 months. Autumn was when the harvest had to be preserved, stored, and organized for winter use. Root vegetables, potatoes, carrots, turnips were packed in the root cellar, sometimes just an extension of the dugout dug deeper into the earth, where constant cool temperatures kept produce from freezing while slowing spoilage. Dried foods represented concentrated nutrition in minimal space. Beans, peas, and lentils could be stored in sacks or barrels, providing protein through winter months when fresh meat was scarce. Corn was dried on the cob and then shelled. The kernels stored for grinding into meal or cooking whole. Wheat, if the family had managed to grow and harvest a crop, was stored as whole grain, precious for making bread that provided calories and substance to winter meals. Preserved meats were critical protein sources. Pork was salted down in barrels, the salt drawing out moisture and creating conditions hostile to bacteria, allowing the meat to keep for months. Beef was sometimes dried into jerky, strips of meat dried until hard and nearly moisture-free. The preserved meat was usually too salty to eat without soaking, but it was food, it was calories, it was the difference between health and starvation. Fruits were preserved as jams and jellies when sugar was available, or dried when it wasn't. Wild fruits gathered in summer, choke cherries, plums, grapes, were boiled down into thick preserves or dried into leather-like sheets that could be reconstituted later. Every jar of preserves represented hours of summer labour, picking in heat and among thorns, standing over boiling pots, but also represented future meals when fresh food would be memory. The milk cow, if a family was fortunate enough to have one, became even more valuable in winter. Fresh milk provided essential nutrition, particularly for children. Butter churned from cream was precious fat for cooking and a rare taste treat. Buttermilk, the liquid remaining after churning, was drunk or used in cooking, wasting nothing. But maintaining a milk cow through winter required its own preparations: hay cut and stored for fodder, grain saved to supplement the cow's diet, shelter provided to protect the animal from worst weather. Chickens that survived winter provided occasional eggs, though production dropped dramatically in cold months and short days. The hens needed protection from cold, care and feeding, and encouragement through supplemental light and warmth to continue any egg production at all. The trade-off in feed consumed versus eggs produced often favoured simply eating the chickens in autumn, but the psychological value of fresh eggs in deep winter sometimes outweighed pure economics. Once winter settled in earnest, the daily routine shifted to focus on maintaining warmth and conserving resources. Fire management became central to existence. The stove or fireplace had to be fed constantly but not wastefully. Too much fuel burned meant exhausting supplies before spring. Too little meant cold that could lead to illness or death. The art lay in maintaining just enough heat for comfort and safety, no more. Night brought special challenges. Letting the fire die completely meant waking to a frigid space, but maintaining fire through the night required someone to wake periodically and add fuel. Many families developed systems where adults took turns, one staying awake while the other slept, then switching. Or they mastered the art of banking the fire, arranging fuel and damping airflow so the fire would burn slowly through the night without requiring attention, producing enough heat to keep the space from freezing but not so much as to waste precious fuel. The morning fire-building ritual shaped each winter day's start. Someone, usually the father but sometimes an older child, would rise in pre-dawn cold and coax the banked coals back to flame. The fire would be fed carefully, building heat gradually. Meanwhile, the family huddled in bedding, waiting for warmth to spread through the small space. When the dugout reached tolerable temperature, the family would rise and begin the day's routines. Clothing strategies were critical for winter survival. Layers were essential, as they trapped air that body heat could warm. Wool was prized for its insulating properties even when damp. Leather provided wind protection. Furs, if available, provided the ultimate warmth, but were expensive luxuries most families couldn't afford. Clothing worn indoors was different from that needed for venturing outside. Going out meant bundling in every available layer, wrapping scarves around face and neck, covering hands with mittens that became stiff with cold but were essential protection against frostbite. Feet were particularly vulnerable to cold. The earthen floors of dugouts were cold to the touch despite the relative warmth at breathing level. Families developed various strategies. Wooden platforms or boards laid over the most used floor areas. Thick socks changed frequently as they absorbed foot moisture that would otherwise cause chilling. Footwear that insulated from the cold floor while being easy to remove when entering the dugout from outside. Managing moisture and humidity inside the sealed dugout was a constant challenge. Breathing, cooking, drying clothing all added moisture to the air. In a tightly sealed space, this moisture had nowhere to go, condensing on cold surfaces and creating dampness that was uncomfortable and potentially unhealthy. Some families rigged primitive ventilation systems, tubes leading from interior to exterior that allowed some air exchange without losing too much heat. Others simply accepted the dampness as unavoidable price of staying warm. The psychological challenges of winter confinement were as significant as physical hardships. When blizzards made going outside impossible, families might be trapped together for days. Cabin fever was a real phenomenon, mental state where irritability and restlessness grew as confinement extended. Managing this required conscious effort to maintain routines, to find constructive activities, to give family members as much space as the cramped quarters allowed. Storytelling became more than entertainment. It was mental health strategy. The act of narrative, of using language to create world beyond the physical confines of the dugout, provided psychological relief from confinement. Some families would recount the same stories repeatedly, finding comfort in familiar narratives. Others invented new stories, collaborative efforts where family members took turns adding to ongoing tale. Reading, for families who possessed books and could read, was precious activity. A single book might be read repeatedly until every family member knew it nearly by heart. The Bible was most commonly owned book, providing both spiritual sustenance and reading material. Newspapers, if obtainable, were read until they fell apart, and then the fragments were put to use as wallpaper or insulation, or even for necessary bodily functions. Handwork kept idle hands busy. Women sewed and mended, tasks that were both necessary and occupying. Men whittled and carved, repairing tools or creating toys for children. Children learned skills from parents, not just for education, but to fill hours that would otherwise breed restlessness. The act of creation, of making something useful from raw materials, provided satisfaction that passive activities couldn't match. Music, when instruments were available and someone could play, transformed morale. A fiddle or harmonica could turn a dreary evening into celebration. Songs sung together created family cohesion and lifted spirits. The music didn't have to be skilled or sophisticated. The simple act of making sound together, of creating harmony, served deep psychological needs. The observation of holidays took on special significance during winter isolation. Christmas became marker the long cold stretch, something to prepare for and anticipate. Gifts were humble, often handmade from scraps, but they represented care and connection. Special meals, featuring hoarded treats, created memories that lasted lifetimes. These occasions broke the monotony, and reminded families that there was more to existence than mere survival. Physical exercise, challenging in cramped quarters, was still important for maintaining health. Children were encouraged to run in place, to play active games that burned energy and built warmth. Adults stretched and moved deliberately, fighting the natural tendency towards sedentary behavior that confinement encouraged. The awareness that activity generated warmth, that movement helped maintain both physical and mental health, drove effort to stay active even when motivation was low. Tracking time became important psychologically. Families marked days on calendars, counting down to spring's eventual arrival. The winter solstice was noted as turning point, the day after which daylight would gradually increase. These markers provided structure and hope, evidence that winter's grip was not eternal, even when it felt that way. The interactions with outside world, rare as they were in winter, took on outsized importance. If a neighbour managed to visit during a break in weather, the social contact was cherished. News from distant places, whether brought by occasional travellers or read in outdated newspapers, connected families to larger world beyond their frozen isolation. Letters, if mail service managed to reach even isolated homesteads, were treasured, read and reread, connections to family and friends in distant places. The spring thaw's first signs, appearing typically in March or early April, brought relief so profound it almost felt like rebirth. When the first drops of water fell from icicles during midday warmth, when the first patch of bare ground appeared on a south-facing slope, when the first bird calls signalled returning migrants, families knew they'd survived another winter. The accomplishment was real and significant. They'd faced nature at its most challenging and prevailed. The skills required for winter survival in dugouts were not innate but learned, often through hardship. Families who survived their first winter emerged changed, toughened, wiser about what the plains demanded. Those who failed to adequately prepare, who underestimated the cold or the isolation or the psychological toll, sometimes didn't survive to benefit from lessons learned. The high stakes made winter preparation and survival strategies matters of life and death, giving urgency to knowledge that was shared within communities and passed from experienced settlers to newcomers. The success of these winter survival strategies varied with circumstances. A well-prepared family with adequate food stores, sufficient fuel, sound shelter, and good health had excellent chances of reaching spring intact. Families facing winter with depleted resources, inadequate shelter, illness, or simply bad luck could find survival elusive. The randomness of outcomes, the way small factors could cascade into catastrophe, created anxiety that never fully disappeared even for experienced plainspeople who'd survived multiple winters. But survive they did. Thousands of families year after year through winters that would appall modern Americans accustomed to centrally heated homes and grocery stores stocked year-round. They survived through preparation, determination, mutual support, and stubborn refusal to surrender to conditions that seemed designed to defeat human habitation. Their success in making homes in underground shelters on windswept prairies stands as testament to human adaptability and resilience in the face of environmental extremes. Living in an underground shelter on the frontier was never easy, but the specific challenges and dangers went far beyond mere discomfort. These structures, for all their advantages in insulation and wind protection, presented numerous hazards that required constant vigilance. Understanding these dangers reveals both how precarious pioneer life truly was and how carefully settlers had to manage risks that modern people rarely have to consider. Water infiltration was perhaps the most common serious problem faced by dugout residents. Unlike above-ground structures where leaks were annoying but manageable, water entering a dugout threatened the structural integrity of the shelter itself. The earthen walls that provided such excellent insulation when dry could become unstable or even collapse when saturated. Roofs that had to bear the weight of earth and sod could fail catastrophically if water undermined their support. Spring brought the most water-related dangers. Snowmelt created runoff that had to go somewhere. Dugouts located in poor drainage situations could find themselves surrounded or even invaded by water. A dugout situated in what seemed like good location during dry autumn construction could turn into a sump during spring thaw. Some families woke to find several inches of water on their floors, their stored goods floating, their furniture ruined. More terrifying were the flash floods that occurred during intense thunderstorms. The same creek bank that provided a convenient hillside for dugout excavation could become a torrent during sudden rain. Families had drowned in their dugouts, trapped by rising water that filled the space faster than they could escape. The accounts of these tragedies passed among pioneer communities served as grim reminders to choose sites carefully and always maintain awareness of weather conditions that could turn deadly. Even without catastrophic flooding, persistent dampness created ongoing problems. Water seeping through walls or roof made everything in the dugout permanently damp. Bedding became mouldy. Stored food spoiled. The constant moisture created respiratory problems and contributed to rheumatism and other ailments. The smell of mildew permeated everything. Some families abandoned dugouts not because the structures failed physically, but because the dampness made them uninhabitable. Structural collapse was another ever-present danger. The walls of a dugout were simply shaped earth, held in place by the cohesion of soil and roots. Over time, these walls could weaken. Moisture was usually the culprit, saturating the earth and destroying its structural integrity. Sometimes the collapse was gradual, walls slowly slumping inward over months. Other times it was sudden and catastrophic. Roof collapses, while less common than wall failures, were more immediately dangerous because they happened without warning. The weight of earth and sod on the roof, perhaps a ton or more, was supported by timber beams that could rot, break under load, or be undermined by water damage. When a roof collapsed, anyone beneath could be buried alive, suffocated in tons of earth before rescue was possible. The fear of roof collapse haunted some residents, making them unable to relax even in their own homes. The excavation process itself could be dangerous. Men digging dugouts sometimes triggered cave-ins, especially when working alone without someone to watch for warning signs of instability. The collapse of a wall during excavation could bury the worker, and if he was alone, no one would know to look for him until it was too late. These accidents were often fatal, leaving families without their primary breadwinner and facing winter in an incomplete shelter. Fire presented paradoxical dangers in dugouts. While the structures themselves wouldn't burn, being essentially made of earth, fire inside a dugout was still extremely hazardous. The confined space with limited ventilation meant smoke accumulated quickly, potentially causing suffocation before flames became a direct threat. Carbon monoxide from incomplete combustion could poison residents without warning, a silent killer that explained some mysterious deaths in dugouts, chimney fires, when creosote buildup in stovepipes or chimneys ignited, created smoke and toxic fumes that filled the confined space. The smoke had nowhere to go except through the living space. Families had to choose between staying inside and suffocating or fleeing into potentially deadly cold. Some accounts describe families wrapped in blankets huddling outside in sub-zero temperatures while smoke cleared from their dugout, risking frostbite because staying inside meant certain death from smoke inhalation. The risk of the dugout itself catching fire came primarily from the roof. The grass and brush layer between the earth and the supporting timbers was combustible. If sparks from the chimney landed on this material, or if the chimney overheated and ignited surrounding materials, fire could spread through the roof structure. While this wouldn't create flames inside the living space, it would destroy the roof's waterproofing and potentially weaken the supports, leading to collapse. Ventilation problems extended beyond fire and smoke to the simple matter of air quality. A sealed dugout in winter, closed against cold, had minimal air exchange with outside. The oxygen depleted as residents and any cooking fire consumed it. Carbon dioxide built up from breathing. The air became stale and stuffy. In extreme cases, the oxygen level could drop enough to cause health problems, headaches, fatigue, difficulty thinking clearly. Some families, recognizing this danger, made small ventilation openings that remained open even in winter, accepting some heat loss as necessary trade-off for breathable air. Others relied on the imperfect sealing of doors and windows, the small gaps that allowed some air exchange even when the dugout was officially sealed. But families too successful at weatherproofing their dugouts could inadvertently create suffocation hazards. Animals presented various dangers to dugout residents,